For the message, we can read our text again. Our text will be Mark 8, verses 27 to 38. I'll begin reading at verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." Thus far, our text. Brothers and sisters, in a lot of ways, the Christian life in Canada can be pretty good. The Canadian Christian, as opposed to Christians from many other places in the world, is privileged, generally speaking. Some of us do suffer a great deal. Some of us have difficult lives. But to be a Christian in Canada is generally fairly privileged compared to being a Christian in, say, China or Iran. The Christian church in Canada has many advantages. Christians enjoy tax deductions, public holidays, usually legal protections for their religion. They usually have buildings and places to worship. Nobody harasses them when they go to church. They have good seminaries that teach their pastors. Nobody commands a Christian not to read his Bible, at least not generally speaking in Canada. And things are getting harder, but at present, Christians, I would say, are privileged. Canadian Christians are also generally quite wealthy and successful, although not always. Some of us aren't, and some of us do suffer. But in general, again, Christians run businesses, they run charities, they carry on successful careers. Many of them do well and have done well. And now it seems to me that when you read our passage for today, Mark 8, verse 27 to 38, this passage where Jesus talks about denying self, carrying crosses, this passage is a bit jarring for us, at least for me. This passage is somewhat puzzling. It's a little bit hard to really grasp. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And if I had to confess something, I would say those words have been ringing through my head ever since I left seminary, and I don't know why. What does it mean to deny myself, to deny yourself, take up your cross in Canada today? What does that mean? How is that practically speaking done? Today's sermon is going to be an investigation of that question based on the passage that we read today. And today's sermon will come to you with this theme: if you would follow your suffering Lord, then you must be ready to deny yourself and pick up your cross. In the first place, we'll see a right but inadequate confession. And then in the second place, deny yourself and take up your cross. So we'll start with our first point, because in order to understand our question, we first need to understand our passage, and particularly some of the background to it. Mark 8, the chapter 8, and particularly verses 27 to 30, is the climax of the first half of the book of Mark. In fact, this passage is actually the center of the book, numerically speaking. The first half of the book of Mark is about Jesus' ministry in the north of Israel in the area of Galilee. And the big question that comes from the first 8 chapters of Mark is, who is Jesus? At the beginning of the book, it's a mystery, although Jesus gives clues. And by chapter 8, Peter's confession is this climactic statement: Jesus is the Messiah. It's interesting that these verses begin, verse 27 and onward, the verses begin with Jesus and his disciples traveling on a road. The road in an area called Caesarea Philippi, the very north of Israel, probably one of the most northernmost places that Jesus teaches. That's important, because at this point, as they're traveling on the road of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus gets as far north as he can, and now he's going to begin his journey to the cross in Jerusalem to the south. And so it's important that they're walking on a road. And while walking on the road, Jesus asks his disciples the big question that's been lingering in the air for the last 8 chapters. Who do people say I am? The disciples answer, well, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, perhaps others say one of the prophets. Right? Given the miracles that Jesus is doing, the 4,000 people that he's fed, the 5,000 that he fed at a different time, the winds that he's stilled on lakes, the people he's healed, it's a logical conclusion that Jesus is obviously someone very special. He's certainly not an ordinary man. There must be something going on here. And people have been speculating, well, perhaps he's an Old Testament prophet. But they still don't understand the fullness of what this all means. And then he turns the question to his disciples. Who do you say I am? And Peter answers with this magnificent confession. You are the Christ, or you are the Messiah, the anointed one, the one Israel has been waiting for. And again, this confession is the climax of chapters 1 through 8. In fact, the word Messiah has not been mentioned in the book of Mark since chapter 1, verse 1. When Mark introduces the book, the beginning of Jesus is the Messiah, and now we finally have the second occurrence of Messiah in chapter 8. The first chapters are building to this moment. And Jesus orders his disciples to stay silent about this confession. He's not ready to be unveiled fully to the people. This makes sense to us. Given who Jesus is, he must be the Messiah. It makes sense. But it's what happens in the next chapter that becomes so strange and that creates the controversy of the chapter. Because in verse 31, Jesus does something very unusual in response to Peter's confession. Look what he says. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Now, this is the first time the disciples learn about what's going to happen to Jesus. In the book of Mark, from this point onward, there's going to be 3 predictions of Jesus' death and resurrection. This is the first prediction. The disciples did not realize at this point what Jesus' messiahship entailed. And Peter, like the rest of the disciples, he thinks this is outrageous. Jesus is going to suffer and die? No way. That doesn't make any sense at all. How could this person be the coming king of Israel, as someone who's going to be powerful and rule, but he's going to suffer and die? Peter, look what he does. Peter took him aside and he began to rebuke him. Right, they're walking on a road in Caesarea Philippi. Jesus is probably walking up ahead. And Peter goes up to him and he pulls Jesus to the side of the road and he says, Lord, no way. This is not going to be how things go. It's important to remember that before meeting Jesus, Peter was a member of a group called the Zealots. The Zealots were a Jewish rebel group that wanted to overthrow the Roman government by force, by rebellion and guerrilla warfare. And so when Peter meets Jesus and he sees the power of Jesus and he sees that Jesus is the Messiah, Peter is thrilled. He's thrilled to see Jesus, finally the coming king, who can overthrow all these foreign rulers and rebuild the nation of Israel. This is great. And so when Jesus begins talking about suffering and death and all this gloomy stuff, Peter is incensed. He immediately acts to stop this defeatist talk. From Peter's perspective, Jesus is like a soldier. He's lost his will to fight. Peter needs Jesus to stiffen up, a stiff upper lip. Jesus needs to remove these gloomy talk of suffering and death from his mind. This is awful. But Jesus' response is swift and strong, isn't it? Jesus stops on the road. He turns to look at his disciples. And he says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the concerns of men." And Peter and the disciples are rather stunned. You know, and I suspect that many of us here are equally stunned. Or maybe not as stunned as they were. But it is a rather stunning reversal, isn't it? In one moment, Peter confesses this majestic truth, "You are the Christ," and the next moment, he's compared to Satan. It's a rather stunning contrast. You see what's happening here, brothers and sisters, is that Peter understood correctly that Jesus was the Messiah, the coming king. But he did not understand the fullness of that confession. He did not understand that to be the Messiah meant suffering and death. You see, again, as I've said before, this precise moment, Peter confesses the Christ, and then Jesus compares him to Satan. This moment is the direct middle of Mark. From this moment onward, Jesus begins his journey to the cross. To confess and to be the Messiah entails death and suffering. The next chapters are all part of a journey from the north of Israel to Jerusalem. And it's God's design that Jesus, in order to become king, has to suffer and die. That's how Jesus gains victory. Now you might be here today and you might say, why on earth is that the case? Why does Jesus have to suffer and die? There's a bit of an extended explanation for this. The whole Christian faith is an explanation of this in some ways. The basic truth is, brothers and sisters, that when man sinned in Genesis 3, God's perfect justice demanded that man had to pay for his sin and his rebellion against God with death. God is perfectly just. He cannot tolerate any disobedience. But instead of destroying rebellious mankind, God decided to show mercy and compassion to man. He let man off the hook, so to speak. But in order to show man compassion and mercy, God had to satisfy his perfect justice. And God did this by sending Jesus Christ to take the punishment that all human beings deserve. The punishment had to be suffering and death. It couldn't be anything less than that. That's the consequence of disobeying God. By suffering and dying and then rising victorious on the third day, Jesus enabled what we call reconciliation. But through him became a way for man to be reunited to God once again. For God to dwell among man, to know us, to bless us, to love us, to prosper us. Through Jesus, that way is now open. Now, one of the things that's not always talked about, but is obviously a consequence, is that by enabling a way for man to be reunited to God, that was also a defeat for Satan and sin. Because if God does not have a relationship with man, that means that sin and Satan rules. A man who does not have a relationship with God is a man who is ruled by sin and the devil. That man or woman has no defense against the devil or his sin. He is enslaved without God. And Satan loves to hate us. Satan possesses and uses people who belong to him. But by enabling reconciliation, Jesus defeats sin and Satan because man can now be loved by God and protected by God. Now this is very important for our passage. Because Jesus calls Peter Satan. Why? Why does Jesus compare Peter to Satan? You see, this is a reminder, brothers and sisters, of the temptation of Jesus in Matthew 4. In Matthew 4, Satan tries to tempt Jesus. There's various ways that he does this, but remember the final temptation at the end of Matthew 4 is where Satan tempts Jesus, and he takes Jesus to a very high point, and he says, all these kingdoms of the world, I am willing to give them all to you if only you bow down and worship me. And Satan's temptation there, brothers and sisters, the real temptation that Satan is giving Jesus there, is that Satan is tempting Jesus by giving him a way to be king over this earth without having to suffer and die. It's the easy way. Jesus can be king over this earth, and he doesn't have to die. He doesn't have to go through the cross. He doesn't have to experience the forsakenness of God. He can receive the whole world because Satan will just give him the whole world. Of course, in so doing, Jesus would lose because Satan would win. Peter's rebuke of Jesus is the same as Satan's temptation. It's the same philosophy. Peter's rebuke of Jesus is essentially to try to convince Jesus or to wish Jesus to accomplish his mission by something other than suffering and dying. By using human means. Peter wants Jesus to conquer the whole world through armies and through using his divine power to conquer the world and bring it to himself. Now, Jesus will do that, but it won't necessarily be through raising an army and marching around with soldiers. And Jesus is angered by Peter's comments because Peter is thinking like Satan. This isn't to say that Peter is possessed by Satan or anything like that. That's not the point. Satan is an adjective here. Doing what Peter wants is defeat. It seems like victory to man, but it's defeat to God. Because Peter has identified the wrong enemy. Peter's enemy is other people. But the real enemy of mankind is sin and Satan. And Peter needs to teach Jesus, or Jesus needs to teach Peter about that. And so we reach our second point, deny yourself and take up your cross. Because Jesus uses this stunning reversal of Peter, he uses it to teach his disciples something very profound. You see what he says here in verse 34. He calls the crowd to him along with his disciples, and then now he's going to teach something. He calls the crowd, now he's going to teach something big. Look what he says. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. In other words, as one church father said, Jesus is saying to Peter, do not by any means imagine that what you're doing, this walking after me, is the true following of me. You should not expect, Peter, that just because you walked behind me around Galilee, that there is only crowns and good things to expect. It's not enough for your salvation to simply walk behind me in Galilee while I do my ministry. No, Peter. It's hurtful and destructive for you to hinder me and to be displeased at my suffering. It will be impossible for you to be saved unless you yourself be continually prepared for death. You see, this teaching is rather difficult. Not only does Jesus going to suffer and die at the hands of men, but his followers are going to suffer the same, to varying degrees. And Jesus is saying you need to be ready for that if you're going to be worthy of me. This is something quite shocking to the disciples, and I think it's equally shocking for us. And Jesus says, look, if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to become like me in your willingness to endure suffering and death. You're going to have to deny yourselves, he says. You're going to have to abandon your desire to make your name in this world. You're going to have to refuse to think about what you want and what you think is good for you, and you're going to have to give that up for my sake. The Christian, he says, the disciple in my world or in my following is going to let his or her dreams of success die. He's going to admit, like the Catechism says, that I am not my own, but belong to Jesus Christ, body and soul, both in life and death. And such a Christian, Jesus says, is going to pick up his cross and follow Jesus. What does that mean? Well, the best theologian on this is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He wrote extensively about this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as you know, died in a prison cell in Nazi Germany in 1944. He suffered. He said it this way: the cross means sharing the suffering of Christ to the last and the fullest. Every Christian has his own cross waiting for him, a cross destined and appointed by God. Each must endure his allotted share of suffering and rejection. But each has a different share. Some God deems worthy of the highest form of suffering and gives them the grace of martyrdom, while others he does not allow to be tempted above that which they are able to bear. But it is one and the same cross in every case. Every Christian has his own cross waiting for him. It's a different cross, but yet the same suffering. Each has a different share, but each does have a share. To believe in Jesus Christ, this is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, look, to believe in me and my death, which was shameful, it's a belief that's not popular to this world. It's a belief that's going to be strange to the people. It's going to entail suffering like me. Now, like I said before, I've often wondered, what does this really mean? What is my cross? What is that? What does it mean in Canada, in Brampton? How do we carry crosses here? It seems like in so many ways we don't have to, because we can sort of isolate ourselves as Christians in Brampton and sort of live on our own, away from the world, and just sort of, we're able to hide. And I found a story. This is a story that a friend of mine told me many years ago. A story about a friend of his that worked in his logging company. This is a friend of mine who owned a logging company in the coastal mountains of British Columbia. One year he hired a man named Bob to join the logging crew. In the first weeks on the job, it became clear that Bob was not like the other men on his crew. Bob didn't join in the crew joking or look at pornography or trash talk about women or engage in fighting at the bars on the weekend like most loggers did, at least at that time. Bob didn't do the other things that the men did. And so the other men immediately took offense at Bob. They started to call Bob Preacher Bob. The irony of this was that Bob never preached at anyone. Bob simply went around his work and did his share. But my friend said that the reaction to Bob for being a good person was visceral. The crew hated him. They questioned his manhood, they pushed him around, and they did whatever nasty thing they could to do to him for months. My friend said, Bob never responded with revenge or anger. Instead, over time, Bob brought cookies to work. He invited the men over to his house on the weekend for coffee. Bob treated everyone with kindness and worked hard. He never compromised his standards in the process. By thinking of this story, I'm suggesting to you that Bob's mockery, the abuse he received on the logging crew was his cross, or one of his crosses. It's important to recognize here also that when Jesus asks a Christian to pick up his cross, he's not talking about suffering in general. Although no doubt the evil of this world creates lives of suffering for us. And that's hard for many of us. Many of us have sicknesses or anxiety or depressions or things that afflict us, and those things are hard. And sin causes that. But what Jesus is particularly talking about in this passage is the suffering that people suffer for his sake. I mean, even a follower of Satan will suffer for Satan, so to speak, right? But what kind of suffering do we do for Jesus? Right? Jesus says in the next line of our passage, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. And this actually, in some ways, makes sense. Jesus suffered and died for us. It makes sense that to carry our cross is to suffer for him. You see, there's a little more to the story about Preacher Bob. I wasn't quite done yet. My friend said this about Bob's impact on the crew over time. He said, and I quote, "The results that summer were remarkable. Guys who had run him down behind his back and often to his face began first to back down and eventually became Bob boosters. Men who had mocked him earlier in the year slowly changed their attitude. And while by summer's end they still called him Preacher Bob from time to time, it was no longer a nasty term." It's interesting that Jesus says, whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. It's not only an eternal thing. To save your life is to receive your life in the next life. It's also a saving of your life in this life. Bob was ready to lose his life, his reputation, his whatever pride he had in this world for the sake of Jesus. And by so doing, he began to gain the true life. The life in which Jesus was proclaimed loudly throughout everything that he did in his life. He who was ready to give up his entire life for Jesus will receive true life now and eternally. In fact, the word for losing life here in this passage is the same word that's used in the Bible for kill and destroy. Apoleo. And so you could say here, whoever is willing to destroy their earthly life for me and the gospel will save it. To be truly human, to be at our best, at our fullest, our most enriched and prospered, is to give up our lives and our earthly desires for the sake of Christ, to live for him and out of him. When you live that way, when Jesus is proclaimed throughout your life, that's when you're fully restored, when your life is fullest, and when eternal life is yours. Brothers and sisters, let me say this. This passage is the great foundation of all witness and evangelism. Jesus could have said here, and really was what he's saying, whoever loses his life for my sake will be a witness to other men. That's a consequence of this passage. There's another story told by a missionary. His name was Adoniram Judson. He's the first missionary to Myanmar or Burma in Southeast Asia. There's a story told about him that goes like this. For 7 heartbreaking years, he suffered hunger and privation in jail. During this time, he was thrown into Eva prison. And for 17 months of that time, he was subjected to almost incredible mistreatment. As a result, for the rest of his life, he carried the ugly marks made by the chains and the shackles that had bound him. Undaunted, upon his release from prison, he asked for permission to enter another province where he might resume preaching the gospel. And the ruler, who of course was godless, indignantly denied the request. He said this, "My people are not fools enough to listen to anything a missionary might say. But I fear they might be impressed by your scars and turn to your religion." I think that's the real root of what Jesus is saying in our passage. I mean, no evangelism technique or training can substitute for a Christian who's willing to suffer for Jesus. Nothing the art of neighboring teaches you can make up for that essential fact. And it's a really hard truth for us. It's a really, really difficult truth because we love our lives. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. It's deeply convicting for me, and I assume for all of you, I hope. We wealthy North Americans, we like to live our lives with our feet in both camps. We want the best of what this world has to offer, and we want the best of what Jesus has to offer. And we don't like choosing between them. One of the problems with North American Christianity is that it seems on the surface like we don't have to choose. It seems like we can have both at the same time. I'm no different. I love to fill my life with planning my next vacation, my plans to snowboard and ski, the next car I'm going to buy, binging on Netflix, whatever. I love all that stuff. I tend to think, and I assume you're no different, that suffering and hard things, those things are an interruption of the good life that I'm supposed to have. I don't like it. I don't like discomfort, and I like to avoid it. That doesn't mean we go out and seek discomfort. That's not the point. The point is that discomfort comes when you live your life for Jesus alone. It's a necessary consequence. One commentator said it this way, "The one for whom the way of Jesus is more important than his own existence will secure his eternal being. But the one whose existence is more important than Jesus will lose both Jesus and his existence." Let's say it this way. To love Christ in the world equally is to deny Christ. To love Christ in the world equally is to deny Christ. The fact is, brothers and sisters, if your faith has never led to any discomfort in your life, there's something out of place. It's not necessarily true, but that's a general proverb that we could say. Again, we don't seek suffering or martyrdom. That's not the point. The church has never taught that. But our faith at some point with the people in the world, our faith has got to lead to some discomfort in our relationships with them. It's got to. There's 8 things I read an article on this, and there's 8 things I want to walk through to put some bones on this. How would it be that our faith would lead to uncomfortableness in our life? What would that look like? What happens if our faith isn't making our life uncomfortable? I'll go through 8 things. I would say your faith is too comfortable if your faith aligns too perfectly with a certain political agenda or party. This is especially true in the United States. If your faith means that you have a certain political ideology and that ideology becomes almost more important than serving Jesus, there's something going on. But less true in Canada. That's number 1. Number 2, if your faith is too comfortable it's probably going to lead to a situation where there's no paradoxes or tensions in your life. There's no unresolved questions in the way you live. The kind of knowledge in that case is the kind of knowledge that has never encountered people who disagree with you. We could call it Facebook knowledge. Kind of knowledge that's reinforced by surrounding yourself with ideas and people who only think like you do. But if you encounter people from the world and they know you're a Christian, it's going to be hard. You're not going to understand always what to say. That's number 2. Number 3, if your faith is too comfortable, your friends and your coworkers will be surprised to learn that you're a church-going Christian. Telling Jesus about your faith has been too uncomfortable, so you never did it. That's number 3. Number 4, you never think about or remember the Sunday sermon on Monday. This is from this article again. I would suggest that if that's true, that's because you didn't come to church to listen. You came to church to check a box. Look what I did for Jesus. That's number 4. Number 5. If your Christianity is too comfortable, no one at church ever annoys you. Because you haven't put any effort into knowing people well enough at church that they would begin to annoy you. This one struck me. Number 6, you never feel challenged, only affirmed in your life. You never bother to look for the idols in your life because you'd rather live your life thinking that you're a good person, even though Jesus says you're not. Number 7, you've never had a truth and love conversation with a fellow Christian. You don't care that much about them anyway, so their errors don't bother you really. Number 8, no one in your church could comment on any area of growth they've seen in you over the years. You've never grown because you've never tried to grow. And I see this and I go through this list to try to put color on the passage. What Jesus is saying, deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me. Deny your life. What does that mean today in Brampton in Canada? And these things, they're not all true for you and they're not all 100% perfectly explained, but these are ways that I'm trying to put color on the passage. What does it mean to be too comfortable in Canada today? If some of these things are true for you or they resonate with you, it could indicate a lack of self-denial. You're too comfortable with this world. Your cross, so to speak, is laying on the ground. You haven't picked it up yet. Then Jesus adds another argument. He says, look, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? What could we possibly be doing in our lives that's more important than giving our souls to Christ? What could possibly you be doing? Can anything in this world give us eternity or even happiness? One author said it this way. He said, the world one can live without. But when one loses one's personhood and very soul and being, what can man give in exchange for it? Or one church father said, the true Christian would give everything he could, even the whole world, if he had it, for the sake of the gospel. Again, the irony is that even if a man gained the whole world, it wouldn't make him happy. Every rich man that's ever lived sees their wealth as a millstone by the time they die. And finally, Jesus gives another argument saying the same thing, and it's probably the strongest argument of all. Look what he says. For if a man is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, if you're ashamed of Jesus' words in an evil generation, that means you're becoming like that generation. If so, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Ouch. That hurts. If we had to put something, if we had the ability to send an email to every single North American Christian in North America, that should be the line. Because it seems to me that a lot of Christians in North America are ashamed of Jesus. They're ashamed, and they're not just ashamed of Jesus. Lots of them are willing to talk about Jesus. They're ashamed of the consequences of believing in Jesus. Who wants to be shamed to the point of standing on a cross? You know, Jesus was nailed to that cross with no clothes on. You think about that? It was shameful. He was whipped. He did things, he had to do things and endure things that are unimaginably awful and shameful. And Jesus is saying, listen, if you're going to follow me, that's going to come for you. Because you can't follow me and not endure some shame from a world that hates me. I mean, it's also worth commenting on that when Jesus is killed and put on the cross, he's put on the cross by the best of humanity, so to speak. A Roman judge condemns him, or doesn't quite. Soldiers put him on the cross. The Jews, with their great legal Sanhedrin, 70 Jews, they sit there. They're the best of the best, the most holy men. The crowds mock him. The disciples abandon him. It's the good things in this world, the things that look impressive, that are the very things that condemn us. We're not going to be rich and powerful in this world if we follow Jesus necessarily. We're not going to have the respect of our society. We shouldn't expect it. Family members are going to hate us. People at work are going to think we're stupid. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's saying, if you're truly going to stand with me, you are not going to be well treated by this world. And so let's conclude with a few thoughts. In this passage, Jesus is teaching us that following him is far more than knowing him. Following him means courageous decisions to stand with him, to follow him, to walk behind him in the same things. And what's striking about Peter and the disciples is that they completely fail to do this. They walk behind him all through Galilee and Judea, and then when the time comes to truly follow him at the cross, they quit. It's called the temptation of the disciples. And it's the temptation that's the biggest single temptation for every single one of us today. That's the great temptation of the Christian life. To say you know Jesus, but not to follow through with any of the consequences. That's the first thing. And the second thing I would say, this hard teaching is not meant in the first place to depress you or to load loads of guilt on you. There should be some guilt when you hear and read these statements if you're not living them out. But the Christian is never ever supposed to carry guilt with them for any extended period. Why not? Because the whole Christian faith is about how you're a depraved sinner in need of the grace and the forgiveness of God. So as soon as you look at this passage and you feel the guilt in your soul, you're meant to go straight to Jesus and throw that guilt on him. And he'll take it. Because this passage is not about necessarily trying super hard. This passage is about how much you need your Savior. And how when you need your Savior and when you're resting in him, when your guilt is put on him, you will want to follow him in such a way that you endure pain and suffering. You'll go, that forgiveness that I've received is way more important to me than this pain that I'm going to endure from our world. We are deeply broken sinners, yet deeply forgiven sinners. And so the thrust of this passage is a call to repentance and belief. Repent of your desires to follow the world. Come to me. Live for me. And when you live for Jesus, the irony is that Jesus will give you what you need to endure the pain and suffering and the death. Jesus is a gracious master. Augustine once said it this way, what he commands is not difficult since he helps effect what he commands. And our self-denial and suffering is then for your own good. It helps ground you into the fact that you need salvation from Jesus. It grounds you. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? And suffering shouts that at you. It shouts that truth constantly. Stop looking to the world. Come to me. I'm the one who will release your burdens, not them. It's a megaphone. And I think at this point it's important to remember that even though Peter denies Jesus 3 times, Jesus still forgives him. Why does he forgive Peter? Because Peter jumped out of the boat when he saw Peter on shore, when Jesus on shore, and he swims out to Jesus. He's ashamed and he was repentant. He wants to be restored to Jesus. And then Jesus forgave him. And that's what Jesus will do for you today as well. But you got to come to him. And you got to live out of him and in him. In order to live for Jesus, you first have to annihilate your visions of how good the life can be without him in this world. That vision will lead to death and pain. And yes, you will suffer for Jesus. But suffering in Jesus, there's no comparison for the beauty of knowing him compared to the death of not knowing him in this world. This world is temporary. So come to Jesus, for in him you will experience suffering, yes, but joy for an eternity.